Hey, I want to talk about the increase in solar stocks lately. Today, solar stocks are down, but over the past week or so, we've seen a huge increase in volume and buying pressure for Jinko Solar, Sunrun, Canadian Solar, and other companies, Solar Edge, First Solar. And this all seems to correlate around the news of increasing oil prices due to the war currently between Russia and Ukraine. So Russia, they export about 25% of the world's oil. So with a bunch of countries sanctioning Russia, uh, stating that they will not accept any Russian oil into their countries, that significantly impacts the supply of oil. Demand, there's no reason for the demand to increase or decrease, but the supply getting cut, pretty much cutting a quarter out of the global oil supply, is going to increase prices. And if you've had to fill up your car recently, you've definitely seen it here in Texas. At least I've seen the price go from $3 to $3.50 in a matter of 2 weeks or so. And you see a lot of European countries, mainly they're the ones that buy the bulk of that Russian oil. You see like Germany saying that they're going to go 100% clean energy by the year 2035 instead of their original projection, which was, I believe, 2055. So instead of building more oil and gas power plants, um, they are going to pivot towards solar and wind. And I believe that line of thinking, that logic, is what is pushing up the solar costs or solar prices, solar stocks. So what I have here is a tab that shows the cost per megawatt hour of the different sources of energy. So here in the middle we have solar. Of course, residential is going to be more expensive. Rooftop solar, commercial and industrial, that's more expensive as well. Falling in the $100 to $200 for a megawatt hour. But utility scale solar, which is where the bulk of solar comes from here in the U.S., I believe 50 to 60% of all solar energy comes from utility. That'd be like your CenterPoint Energy or TXU or whatever. A big utility power company, they can install solar at $28 per megawatt hour. Or you're used to seeing it in kilowatt hours, typically how these costs are measured. So just divide it by a power of 10, basically. So about 3 cents per kilowatt hour for utility solar for crystalline utility scale, and 2.8 cents per kilowatt hour for thin film utility scale. And historically, well, we're used to seeing an average here for natural gas, at about 6 cents per kilowatt hour. So solar falling, I believe like 2 years ago, was pretty big news that solar was finally cheaper, the cheapest form of energy. And the 6 cents per kilowatt hour was the benchmark to beat. But now we're clocking in at 2.8 cents, even 2.6 cents. It looks like it's the lowest recorded installation for wind. So wind's pretty cheap as well. But there have been plans to pivot towards clean energy for a while, but we already built all of these power plants that run on natural gas. We already built all these coal and oil power plants, and in order to avoid eating a huge cost, we have to at least let these plants run through the course of their projected lifetime. Maybe it costs you I don't know, $200 million to build a natural gas power plant. They're going to take that cost and figure how much money they'll make from it over the course of, I don't know, 20 years. And they can figure, okay, here's going to be the price we need to charge per kilowatt hour. And that's assuming we're going to go through the entire 20 years of the factory's life or the power plant's life. So if they just built this natural gas plant and everybody's demanding we switch to wind and solar, then that $200 million cost is just going to be completely ate. Like, they're not going to be able to make any money off of that. So that's undesirable, uneconomical. So that's not the course of action any government or corporation's going to take. And that's why you see projections out till 2035, or in the case of that Germany example I gave, where they were projecting out to 2055. They have to factor in the life of the current power production. So they're pretty much, by cutting the projected date from 2055 to 2035, they're pretty much saying, okay, we're not going to keep buying natural gas. We're not going to keep buying coal. Or we're not going to keep buying oil. We're just going to pivot right now. We're going to make the investment into solar right now. And that's going to be our primary, we're going to let that juice flow into the system. If we have to, we'll use natural gas, whatever. So that's a pretty big move, and that is being driven, maybe in part just to kind of stick it to the Russians in that instance. But also, the other side of it is the cost of natural gas and oil. If it's going to continue to climb, nothing you can do about it. Meanwhile, solar and wind are over here looking very attractive as far as costs go, and not as many negative externalities. Then people will make that switch. If it's starting to become less and less economically viable to continue to run those power plants through their 20-30 years, projected 20-30 years, maybe we just won't do the maintenance required to keep this plant running and we shut it down. Or maybe we don't buy, once the filters are dirty, maybe we don't buy new filters and we just shut down the plant. They have to weigh the economic impact of that. But especially with inflation, everybody, if you were to poll everybody would expect the price of energy to continue to rise. There's more indicators that the price will rise from here than fall. But solar and wind are already extremely cost effective compared to these fossil fuel counterparts. So the higher the price goes, the more inflation plays a role there. That's just going to exacerbate the switch to solar and wind. So when you see these solar companies making this huge jump in a short amount of time, you start to see people start to correlate that solar is an alternative to oil. So instead of just sitting there looking at the gas price going up and up and up, feeling like you can do nothing about it, it seems obvious that solar is an alternative, but the market hasn't historically treated solar as such. So whenever we've seen oil prices increase in the past, you haven't necessarily seen a huge jump in solar. It doesn't reflect in the solar market. Or gas was going down quite a bit a few years ago, and the price of these solar stocks were increasing, which would tell you that the gap between the economic savings between solar and gas at that time were becoming smaller, more and more narrow, yet people were still flooding into solar stocks, contrary to the economics. But here in this instance, we start to see the correlation between high gas price and solar being an alternative. If there's not too many electric vehicles out there, so you could think of gas and oil as, okay, well, we still got to drive. But most power, let's see, at least in the US, um, yeah, fossil fuels make up 60.6% of all electricity generated in the US as of 2020. So, and then here we have solar at 2.3%. So, if gas is becoming more and more expensive, which we use 40.5% of that fossil fuel number is natural gas, if gas is becoming more and more expensive, then we could just pivot to solar, not have to use as much gas in our electricity production, and that starts to significantly decrease demand. And if demand decreases, the price has to follow, because you can't just pump all of this gas out of the ground, not be able to use it. You're gonna incur a bigger cost trying to store that gas than it would to just drop the price. So as the demand decreases, um, the the price will come down. Well, that's kind of a separate argument. In the short term, we're expecting the price to increase, um, which will cause higher demand in the solar market, and we'll see this uh, energy production from solar start to increase the higher the cost of gas goes. Eventually, at some point, they'll equalize, and uh, you could see less demand for solar as they struggle to keep up with the demand, but start to switch back over to gas because of the low cost. But then that gets a little construed because you have the climate change argument that influences governments to continue and companies to continue to switch to renewables. But at least in the foreseeable future, we should see the cost of gas continue to rise, which should correlate to increase in solar demand, which should improve the margins of these solar companies, and we should see the price of these companies continue to increase into the future. Um, at some point, you have to stop and reevaluate due to the falling cost of gas once a significant amount of demand is decreased. But at least for the time being, this is very positive for solar.